You've been running from the wrong thing your entire life. Every time fear grips your chest, every time your body floods with that ancient panic, every time you feel that suffocating tightness wrapping around your throat, you think it's warning you to stop, to retreat, to stay small and safe within the boundaries of what you already know. But what if I told you that fear has never been your enemy? What if every moment of terror you've experienced wasn't trying to cage you, but to reveal something you've been desperately avoiding seeing? Here's what nobody wants to admit. The thing you fear most isn't out there in the world. It's not the job interview, the relationship ending, the financial collapse, the judgment of strangers. The thing you fear most is the person you'd become if you stopped pretending. And fear, real fear, the kind that makes your hands shake and your voice disappear, that's not a wall. It's a mirror. And right now, you're standing in front of it, and you cannot look away. Ibn Arabi understood something that modern psychology is only beginning to grasp. Fear doesn't speak the language of logic. It speaks the language of truth. And the truth it's trying to show you is so uncomfortable, so fundamentally disruptive to the story you've built about yourself, that your entire being would rather interpret it as danger than face what it actually means. If what you're feeling right now is recognition, if there's a cold weight settling in your stomach because you know exactly what I'm talking about, then this channel exists for you. Abiertamente explores the spaces between consciousness and illusion, the psychological architecture of our hidden selves, and the uncomfortable truths that Ibn Arabi and others saw centuries before modern thought caught up. If you're ready to go deeper into what fear is actually revealing about who you are, I invite you to stay and subscribe so we can continue exploring this together. Let me tell you about the anatomy of avoidance. Not the surface-level kind, not the procrastination, the distraction, the endless scrolling through other people's curated lives. I'm talking about the structural avoidance that runs so deep in your psyche that you've built your entire personality around it. You know that feeling when someone asks you what you really want, and you freeze. Not because you don't have an answer, but because the real answer is so terrifying that your mind goes blank, rather than let it surface. That blankness isn't emptiness, it's camouflage. It's your psyche protecting you from seeing yourself clearly, because what you'd see would require you to dismantle everything you've built. Fear operates on layers. The first layer, the one you're most familiar with, is behavioral. It tells you not to speak up in the meeting, not to message that person, not to start that project, not to leave that situation. And you experience this as protection. I'm afraid because this might go wrong. But that's not what's happening. That's the translation your conscious mind gives you because the real message is too destabilizing. The second layer is emotional. This is where fear isn't about a specific action, but about a state of being. You're not afraid of public speaking. You're afraid of being seen. You're not afraid of intimacy. You're afraid of being known. You're not afraid of failure. You're afraid of discovering that you were never as capable as you told yourself you were. Or worse, that you are capable, which means every year you didn't try was a choice you made to stay hidden. But there's a third layer. And this is where Ibn Arabi's insight cuts like a blade through all the psychological noise. The deepest layer of fear isn't about behavior or emotion. It's ontological. It's about existence itself. You're not afraid of what might happen if you act. You're afraid of who you'd have to become if you stopped hiding. Because becoming that person means accepting that the person you've been, the one you've defended, explained, justified for years, was a construction, a defense mechanism with a name and a history. And here's the unbearable part. You already know this. You've always known. Every moment of unexplained anxiety, every night you couldn't sleep for reasons you couldn't name, every time you felt inexplicably suffocated in a life that looked perfectly fine from the outside, that was the knowing trying to surface. That was your deeper self trying to show you the gap between who you are and who you're pretending to be. Fear is the messenger from that gap. Think about the last time you felt genuine, body-altering fear. Not worry, not stress. Real fear. The kind that makes time slow down and your senses sharpen, and your entire being focus on a single point of unbearable intensity. What was it showing you? Most people will tell you a story about the external thing, the almost accident, the confrontation, the loss. But if you sit with it, really sit with it without the narrative, you'll notice something else. The fear wasn't just about what almost happened. It was about what that moment revealed about how you've been living. The near-death experience that shows you how much time you've wasted. The almost ended relationship that reveals how absent you've been. The business failure that exposes how much of your identity was borrowed. Fear crystallizes truth. And truth, when you've been avoiding it long enough, feels like annihilation. Ibn Arabi wrote that the veil between you and divine reality isn't some external barrier. It's your own sense of self. The you that you think you are is the very thing preventing you from experiencing what you actually are. And fear is what happens when that constructed self starts to crack. When the story you've been telling begins to contradict the reality you're experiencing. This is why fear feels so physically intense. It's not metaphorical. When your deepest self recognizes a moment where the false must give way to the true, your body responds as if facing mortal danger. Because it is. The death of the false self feels like death because to the false self, it is death. It doesn't know that something more real is waiting underneath. It only knows it's about to cease existing. And so you run. You develop elaborate systems to never have to face those moments. You choose relationships that don't challenge you, jobs that don't require you to show up fully, cities where no one knows who you used to be, hobbies that keep you busy enough to never sit in silence. You build an entire life architecture designed to keep you from having to look in that mirror. But fear keeps finding you. Because fear isn't trying to stop you. It's trying to show you. Let me tell you about the people who never looked. The ones who spent their entire lives managing fear instead of listening to it. They're not hard to find. They're everywhere. In fact, you might be one of them. They're the ones who, in their final years, talk about the life they meant to live. Not the life they wanted, because they never let themselves want honestly enough to know what that was. The life they meant to live, past tense, as if it was something that could have happened in some alternate timeline, if only the circumstances had been different, if only they'd been braver, luckier, more talented, as if it was always someone else's fault. But the truth they never speak, sometimes never even admit to themselves, is that the fear they spent decades interpreting as a warning was actually an invitation, and they never RSVP'd. They stood at the threshold and told themselves the door was locked, when really they just never tried the handle. This is the quiet tragedy, not the dramatic kind. The explosion, the visible collapse, the clear before and after. The quiet kind. The one where someone lives an entire life adjacent to themselves. Close enough to see the outline of who they might have been, but never close enough to touch it. And they convinced themselves this was wisdom, this was maturity, this was being realistic. They built elaborate philosophies around their avoidance and called it groundedness. They confused settling with stability, numbness with peace, resignation with acceptance. But late at night, in those moments when the defenses are down and the distractions are exhausted, and they're alone with the raw truth of their existence, they know, they've always known. The fear was trying to tell them something, and they spent their whole lives translating it wrong. Here's what Ibn Arabi understood that Western psychology is still struggling with. Your fear map is your soul map. The topology of what terrifies you is identical to the topology of who you actually are beneath all the learned behavior and inherited beliefs and cultural programming. You're not afraid of random things. There's a precise architecture to your fear, and if you had the courage to trace it, to really follow each thread of terror back to its source, you'd discover that every fear points to the same center, the true self you've been taught to hide. You're afraid of being alone because you've never met yourself. You're afraid of being seen because you don't know who would be looking back. You're afraid of having nothing to do because you've structured your entire identity around doing, and without it, you'd have to face the question of who you are when you're not performing. You're afraid of silence because in silence, the false self has nothing to maintain itself with, and it begins to dissolve. And what remains is so unfamiliar, it feels like madness. This is why meditation terrifies people more than they admit, why solitude feels like punishment, why boredom is treated like a disease to be cured immediately with whatever stimulation is nearest. Because these states remove the scaffolding, and without the scaffolding, the construction can't hold itself up. But here's the paradox that keeps most people trapped. The thing you're most afraid of is also the thing you most deeply long for. The dissolution of the false self feels like death and liberation simultaneously. The moment of being truly seen feels like exposure and recognition at the same time. The experience of acting from your actual nature feels like risk and homecoming in the same breath. This is why fear is such a terrible guide when misinterpreted. When you think fear means danger, retreat. You run from the very experiences that would free you. You mistake the discomfort of expansion for the pain of destruction. You interpret the dissolution of limitations as the loss of self, when really, it's the loss of the cage you've been calling a self. Ibn Arabi called this the bewilderment, the haira. That state of being so completely disoriented that all your usual reference points dissolve. And Western thought treats this as something to be avoided, pathologized, medicated away. But for Ibn Arabi, bewilderment was the necessary passage. The moment when the false certainties crumble and something more real can emerge. Fear is the guardian of that passage, not to keep you out, but to make sure you're ready, to make sure you understand what you're choosing when you choose to cross that threshold. Think about this. Every major transformation in your life was preceded by fear. Not followed by it, preceded. The fear came first, like a preview of the person you'd have to become to move forward. And in that moment, you had a choice. You could interpret the fear as a warning to stop, or you could interpret it as information about what becoming requires. The people who transform are not the fearless. That's the lie we tell ourselves. The people who transform are the ones who developed a different relationship with fear. They learn to read it differently, to see it not as an enemy but as a kind of sonar, pinging back information about the shape of the real. When you're about to do something that aligns with your actual nature, fear appears. Not because you're going the wrong direction, but because you're going the right one. Because the right direction requires you to become someone new, and becoming someone new means the death of someone old. And your psyche, not understanding that death and transformation can be the same thing, sends every alarm signal it has. This is why the things you most need to do are often the things you most want to avoid. Why the conversations that would free you are the ones you never have. Why the creative work that would express your actual self is the project you endlessly defer. Why the life that would require you to show up as you really are is the life you keep saying you'll start someday. Someday. That beautiful, tragic word. The place where dreams go to die slowly, painlessly, out of sight. Someday you'll write that book. Someday you'll have that conversation. Someday you'll leave that job, start that business, move to that city, learn that skill, become that person. Someday when you're ready, when the fear subsides, when the conditions are right, when you've figured it all out. But the conditions never become right. The fear never subsides. You never feel ready. Because fear isn't waiting for the right conditions. It's waiting for you to understand what it's actually trying to show you. Let me tell you what fear showed me. Years ago, I was living what looked like a perfectly good life, stable job, respected position, clear path forward, and I was suffocating, not dramatically, no breakdown, no crisis, just this slow, steady sense that I was living someone else's life, making someone else's decisions, moving towards someone else's definition of success. But I couldn't name it. I couldn't point to what was wrong because nothing was wrong. Everything was right. Everything made sense. Every choice was logical, defensible, responsible. And yet every morning I'd wake up with this low-level dread, like I was late for something I couldn't remember. The fear started small, vague anxiety, restlessness, insomnia. Then it escalated, panic attacks in the middle of meetings. That surreal feeling of watching myself from outside my body, wondering who this person was and why I was pretending to be him. Dreams where I was trying to speak but my voice wouldn't work, where I was trying to run but my legs were paralyzed. I tried everything to make the fear stop. Therapy, meditation, exercise, better sleep habits, medication, cognitive restructuring, all the tools we're told will manage anxiety. And they helped at the edges. But the fear kept returning because I was treating it like a malfunction instead of a message. It took me embarrassingly long to understand. The fear wasn't about my life. The fear was my life trying to get my attention. It was the part of me that knew, had always known, that I was living a borrowed existence, that I'd taken someone else's blueprint and convinced myself it was mine, that I'd chosen safety and approval over truth and aliveness. And when I finally listened, not tried to fix or manage or overcome, but actually listened, the fear revealed its architecture. Every panic attack was pointing to a specific lie. Every nightmare was showing me where I was betraying myself. Every moment of paralysis was highlighting a place where I was performing instead of being. The fear was saying, "This isn't you. You know this isn't you. How long are you going to pretend?" And here's what nobody tells you about that moment of recognition. It doesn't make things easier. It makes things harder, because once you see the gap between who you are and who you're pretending to be, you can't unsee it. You can't go back to the comfortable numbness. You can't return to the story you were telling yourself. You're standing in front of the mirror, and the mirror is showing you the truth, and you have to decide what you're going to do with that information. You can turn away, build better walls, develop more sophisticated avoidance strategies, convince yourself that the fear was a glitch, that the comfortable life is the right life, that wanting more is ungrateful or unrealistic or selfish. Or you can let the fear show you who you actually are. This is where Ibn Arabi's teaching becomes not philosophy but survival. He said, "Who knows himself knows his Lord, but the self you know, the one you introduce to people, the one on your resume, the one in your stories about yourself, that's not the self he was talking about. That's the constructed self, the social self, the defended self. The self beneath that, the one fear is trying to reveal, that's something else entirely. That's the self that exists before language and after identity. The self that knows what it wants before culture teaches it what to want. The self that moves towards certain experiences and away from others, not because of conditioning, but because of nature. And that self is terrifying to meet, because it doesn't care about your carefully constructed life. It doesn't respect the decisions you made when you were younger and more afraid. It doesn't honor the compromises you accepted in exchange for safety. It just is. Pure, unconflicted, undeniable. And when fear shows you that self, even for a moment in a flash of recognition, you have to decide, do I honor this or do I bury it again? Most people bury it again. That's not a moral judgment, it's an observation. The pull of the familiar is so strong, and the cost of change is so high, and the uncertainty is so overwhelming, that most people choose to reinterpret what they saw. It was just anxiety. I was overthinking. Everyone feels like this sometimes. They develop amnesia about their own awakening. They forget they ever saw anything different. They rebuild the walls higher and thicker, and the fear, having been ignored again, goes deeper, gets quieter, turns into depression or bitterness or a slow hardening of the heart. But some people don't bury it. Some people, for reasons they can't fully explain, decide to honor what fear showed them. And those people enter a different kind of life, not an easier one, not a more successful one by conventional measures, but a more honest one, a more alive one. They become strangers to their old friends, incomprehensible to their families. They make choices that look reckless or selfish or naive to people who are still living the defended life. They walk away from things that others are desperately trying to acquire. They pursue things that seem meaningless or impractical or too risky, and they suffer. Let's not romanticize it. There's immense suffering in honoring your actual nature in a world that requires you to perform a false one. There's loneliness in being yourself when everyone around you is still in costume. There's practical, real-world consequences to refusing to play the game. But here's what's also true. They stop feeling that underlying dread, that sense of being in the wrong life. That quiet voice that asks every morning, "Is this it?" They stop waking up feeling like they're running late for their own existence, because fear stopped being the enemy and became the guide, the thing that points constantly and reliably toward what's true. Not always what's easy, not always what's comfortable, but what's true. Ibn Arabi wrote that the universe itself is constantly revealing God through endless forms, but humans are so attached to their fixed interpretations that they miss the revelation happening in every moment. The same is true of your life. Every moment of fear is a revelation. Every instance of anxiety is information. Every panic attack is a message. But you're so attached to your interpretation of what fear means that you miss what it's actually showing you. You think fear means I can't do this, but fear is saying doing this will change who you are. You think fear means this is dangerous, but fear is saying this is unfamiliar to your false self. You think fear means I should stop, but fear is saying you should pay attention. This is why the spiritual path and the psychological path converge at the same point. Whether you call it ego death or shadow integration or divine annihilation or authentic self-emergence, it's the same process, the dismantling of the constructed identity and the recognition of what remains. And that process is not peaceful, it's not gentle, it's not a gradual, comfortable unfolding, it's a crisis, an emergency. A moment where everything that felt solid becomes liquid, and everything that felt certain becomes questionable, and everything that felt like you starts to dissolve. And fear is the announcement that this process is beginning. So when fear comes, and it will keep coming because you're still here, still alive, still being called toward your actual life, you have to ask yourself a different question. Not how do I make this feeling go away, but what is this feeling trying to show me? Not what am I afraid of, but who would I have to become if I wasn't afraid of this? Not how do I overcome fear, but what would happen if I followed fear to its source? These questions don't lead to comfort. They lead to truth, and truth, when you've been living in illusion, feels like violence, feels like threat, feels like the end of everything. But here's what Ibn Arabi knew, what mystics across traditions have known, what every person who's ever truly transformed has discovered. The end of everything is also the beginning of what's real. The death of the false self is not the death of self. It's the birth of the actual self, the self that was always there beneath the performance waiting to be recognized. And fear is the labor pain of that birth. You feel it in your body right now, don't you? That recognition, that discomfort, that sense that something is being asked of you and you're not sure you're ready to give it. That's not anxiety, that's the call, the invitation, the moment before transformation, and you're standing at the threshold. Again, like you've stood there 100 times before. You can walk away, you can close this video, return to your day. Forget you felt anything. You can add this to the list of moments you almost changed but didn't. You can tell yourself it wasn't the right time, or you weren't ready, or you need to think about it more. Or you can recognize that fear is showing you right now who you actually are beneath the person you've been pretending to be. And that recognition is terrifying, not because it's wrong, but because it's right. Because if it's right, you have to do something with that information. You have to start making different choices, having different conversations, honoring different values, building a different life. And that means losing the life you have, the one that feels safe because it's familiar, the one that makes sense because you've told its story so many times, the one that others recognize and approve of. You'd have to become unrecognizable, first to others, then to yourself. You'd have to walk through a period where you don't know who you are anymore, where every identity feels like a costume, and every choice feels uncertain, and every day feels like improvisation. You'd have to live in that bewilderment, that hera, until something more real emerged. Most people won't do it. They'll touch this truth, feel its burn, and pull away. They'll return to the script, the performance, the comfortable lies, and they'll feel relief for a while. Then they'll feel the dread again, the knowing, the question, and the cycle continues until they're too old or too tired or too numb to feel it anymore. But you're still feeling it, which means you're not done yet. Which means fear is still trying to show you something. Which means there's still time to listen. Ibn Arabi said the highest station is no station, the place where you stop trying to be anything and simply are what you are. But getting to that place requires passing through every fear, every defense, every constructed identity that stands between you and that original nature. And each fear is a gate, not a wall, a gate. And the key to the gate is the willingness to see what the fear is revealing instead of what you're afraid it's revealing. So here's the question you take with you. What if your fear has been trying to show you who you are your entire life, and you've been misreading it as a warning to stay who you've been? What if the thing you're most afraid of isn't the danger you'd face if you changed, but the truth you'd have to accept if you didn't? What if fear isn't trying to stop you from becoming someone new, but trying to stop you from remaining someone false? Sit with that. Not to find an answer, but to let the question do its work, to let it disturb you, to let it crack something open. Because on the other side of that crack is not the abyss you've been imagining. It's the life you've been avoiding because it required you to be real. And being real, truly, completely, undeniably real, is the most terrifying and liberating thing a human being can do. Fear has been trying to show you that your whole life. The only question is whether you're finally ready to look. Does this land differently than what you expected when you first felt the fear?